Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now, today we'll discuss a module from literary translation in India, and that module is on from the Romance to the Victorians, the evolvement and evolution of translation theories in the West. This module is written by Arindan Kundu, a research fellow, Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur University, Kolkata. People may argue that a translator is alone while translating, sitting on a lonely writing desk. She or he only has the source text in front of it. She or he does not need translation theories as a guide while translating. Sherlock Holmes once said on a different topic, although, that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to fit facts. If we keep aside the complex, debatable relationship between translation practice and theory, there is no point in arguing that to understand the evolution of translation practices, we have to understand the historiography of translation theories. Susan Bassnett rightly argued, no introduction to translation studies could be complete without consideration of the discipline in a historical perspective. Close study of the theorist of the period narrated below will clearly show how the concept of originality and authenticity evolved in the epistemological understanding of Western translations, which later spread to India and affected Indian understanding of translation with the coming in of the British imperialist. Now, let us talk about early thoughts, early theorist, Roman theorist, Cicero, 106 BC to 43 BC. George Taylor, in his seminal book After Babel, which was published in 1997, has distinguished the history of translation theory, practice and literature into four parts. The first period would extend from Cicero's famous precept not to translate verbum pro verbo in his Libellas de Optimo Genere Oraturam of 46 BC, and Horace's reiteration of this formula in the Ars Poetica some 20 years later to Hölderlin's enigmatic commentary on his own translations from Sophocles, 1804. This epoch of primary statement and technical notation may be said to end with Alexander Fraser Tytler's essay on the principles of translation, issued in London 1792. Douglas Robinson too, in his anthology titled Western Translation Theory from Herodotus to Nietzsche, has admitted the primacy of Cicero in the history of translation theory. The central characteristic of this period, as pointed by Susan Bassnett in her book Translation Studies, published in 1980 and again in 2002, is that of immediate empirical focus. The statements and theories about translation stem directly from the practical work of translating. The main theme of this period is the beginning of the debate between word-for-word translation and sense-for-sense translation, a debate that has a long-lasting effect on the later ages, situating the origin of literary translation in the age of Romance. Hugo Friedrich points out in his short speech titled On the Art of Translation 1965 that according to the Romance, translation means transformation in order to mold the foreign into the linguistic structures of one's own culture. Cicero has divided translation practice as two separate polarities, one extreme here and the other extreme there, man of interpreter and man of orator. The former is supposed to be very literal, delivering exactly what the other party has said. The replacement of each individual word of source text with its closest grammatical equivalent in Latin, whereas the latter is supposed to reinvent the text, procure a speech that would move the listeners and make the text anew. Cicero visualizes translation as a stylistic change of the source text according to the stylistic features of the target language, at the same time not violating the form, shape, and ideas of the source text. He is the first theorist in the history of the translation studies who clearly distinguishes between word-for-word translation and sense-for-sense translation. The next one is Horace, who is from 65 BC to 8 BC. According to Quintus Horatius Flaccus, better known as Horace in English world, as he mentions in his Ars Poetica 10 BC to 8 BC, the goal of translation should be producing an aesthetically pleasing and creative text in the target language. Douglas Robinson once asked that though here are terms of classifications regarding translation process free and faithful, neither Cicero nor Horace have used the terms like free or translation to denote their process. Only Horace has used the term faithful. Both Horace and Cicero did not advocate servile imitation of the source language text. In the classical Roman or Cicerorean Horatian tradition, most of the educated Romans had a fair knowledge of Greek. So translation from Greek language into Latin language was not for those who cannot understand the Greek, but for those aesthetes who would appreciate the beauty of the translatorial process into Latin. The stress was on enriching Latin vocabulary and language rather than on showing faithfulness to the original Greek text. That is why Horace advised the translator to invent new words to add to the vocabulary of his language. The primary responsibility of the translator was to the target language reader, and so there was no need to translate word for word. It was enough if they were able to reproduce the sense of the original source language work. According to Bassett, since enrichment of the literary system is an integral part of Roman concept of translation, Horace and Cicero both considered judicious interpretation of the source language text so as to produce a target language version based on the principle non verbum de verbo sed sensum exprimere de sensu, of expressing not word for word but sense for sense. And his responsibility was to the target language readers. So in this classical Roman period, we see that the sense for sense translation has been preferred over word for word translation. Now let us talk something about medieval period. During the Middle Age and Renaissance, there was no concrete theory of translation as such. Their methods of translation adapted by individual translator as described in the preface, introductions, commentaries, etc. of the translations are the only sources to know about the translation strategies. Anglo-Saxon period. If we go through the Anglo-Saxon writers of the medieval age, we will find out suggestive statements from the prefaces of translated text which give us a fair idea on the methods of translations employed in this era. The preface of the Alfred the Great's Old English translation of Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, 590 AD, says, among other various and manifold troubles of this kingdom, sometimes word by word and sometimes according to the sense, in the translation of the Consolation of Philosophy of Boethius by King Alfred, similar kind of strategy was undertaken, as he oscillates between word for word and sense for sense translation. Wherever he felt suitable, Robert Stanton, in his book The Cultures of Translation in Anglo-Saxon England, argues that Alfred demonstrated the tension between preservation and creation, and he claimed translation as a preservative agent. Alfric, translating a century later, was using the similar kind of translation strategy, as he repeatedly uses sense for sense translation, not always word for word translation. Now let us talk about the theories which were emerged from the other geographical spaces of world than the British, Roman and Roman, Greek, Latin sphere. Arabic. During the Middle Ages, as Arabic became the international lingua franca, there were numerous translations of Greek philosophy, medicine, astrology, and scientific books. Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad during the rule of the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, became the center for translational activities. Various scientists, come translators like Ibn Ishaq, Ibn al-Batrik, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and Farabi emerged during this era. The debate between the two major translation methods, word for word and sense for sense translation, also cropped up, and while translators like Ibn Ishaq preferred sense for sense translation, Ibn al-Batrik tended to word for word method. Pre-Renaissance period. By the 16th century, the view that was gaining ground was that a personal knowledge of scripture is precisely what ordinary people needs to most for their own spiritual good. The intention of Saint Jerome, translating into Latin the Hebrew version of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New Testament, was that ordinary Christians of the Roman Empire should be able to read the Word of God. Ignorance of the Scriptures, he wrote, is ignorance of Christ. Bible translation. Western translation theories owe a good deal to sacred text translation, as because of the special issues involved, the subject area provided a major impetus for comment and argument about authority, translatability, and methodology. The major shift in the history of the translation history came with the spread of Christianity, strictly a text-based religion. Though the Roman translators preferred sense for sense translation over word for word, the Bible translators has been instructed by the church strictly to avoid sense for sense method. Since the term translation means interpretation, sense for sense method or free translation, it could lead to open interpretation of the word of God and thus blasphemy. So the concept of fidelity or absolute rendering of the original text is solicited. Though Saint Jerome following Cicero and Horace, one of the first translators of the Bible, did a sense-for-sense translation, and later this version became the founding stone of Vulgate Bible. St. Jeremy, in defense of his translation of the Greek Old Testament into Latin, says, "Now I am not only admit but freely announce that in translating from the Greek, except of course in the case of the Holy Scripture, where even the syntax contains a mystery, I render not word for word, but sense for sense." The first translation of the complete Bible into English was the Wycliffe Bible, 1380 to 1384. And the target of the translation was the public access of the biblical knowledge by each and every person. Obviously, he and his followers were attacked as heretics. After his death, John Purvey, disciple of Wycliffe, revised the translation and in his preface clearly states that the translator should translate after the sentence or meaning and not only after the words or literal. William Tyndale's translation of the New Testament, which happened in 1525 based upon sense for sense method, was also intended to offer as much a clearer vision as possible to the layman, but to protect the preoccupation of the Roman Catholic Church for the correct established meaning of the Bible, he was burned by the Church. Any translation diverging from the accepted interpretation was likely to be deemed heretical and to be censored or banned. Jeremy Mundy, in his book Introducing Translation Studies, which was published in 2008, has observed that advances in the study and knowledge of the biblical languages and classical scholarship, typified by Erasmus' edition of the Greek New Testament in 1516 and the general climate of the Reformation and spurred by the new technology of the printing press, led to a revolution in Bible translation practice which dominated 16th century book production in Europe. The history of Bible translation in the 16th century is intimately tied up with the rise of Protestantism in Europe. Martin Luther, chief protagonist in the history of Christian theology and Protestant Reformation, has shifted the focus towards the target culture and target readers instead of serving the source text and its intended readers. He has advised the would-be translator to use a vernacular proverb or expression if it fitted in with the New Testament. In other words, to add to wealth of imagery in the source language text by drawing on the vernacular tradition too. Now, let us talk about Etienne Dolet, 1509 to 1546. Etienne Dolet, a French humanist, was one of the first theoreticians who tries to formulate translation theory and who was found a heretic for his mistranslation of one of Plato's dialogue. The Greek text or source text, Plato's Axiokos, stated that after a person dies, there is nothing left, which Dolet translated as there is nothing left at all. Thus, he put more emphasis in the target text rather than the source text. The church has interpreted it as denying the immortality of the soul and tried and executed him for heresy. Theo Hermans reflects upon Dolet's short treatise, just over 1,000 words, titled How to Translate Well from One Language into Another. It enjoys the honor of being the first general theoretical treatise on translation written in a West European vernacular. There are earlier texts in Latin, and there are also occasional texts like prefaces, dedications, and criticism in various vernacular languages. But this is the first general reflection on translation in a European vernacular. Susan Bassett has summarized the principles of Dolet as follows. Number 1. The translator must fully understand the sense and meaning of the original author, although he is at liberty to clarify obscurities. Number 2. The translator should have a perfect knowledge of both source language and target language. The translator should avoid word-for-word renderings. The translator should use forms of speech in common use. The translator should choose and order words appropriately to produce the correct tone. Here, as we can understand, Dolet is stressing not only on sense-for-sense translation, but also on the fair understanding of the source language and culture, as well as the target language and culture. Now, let us discuss about the Renaissance period. In the early years of the 15th century, Renaissance humanists insisted that the capacity to translate text from Greek and Hebrew into Latin and later into and between vernacular tongues was a critical aspect of grammar and rhetoric. George Chapman, 1559 to 1634. George Chapman, the famous translator of Homer, restated the above mentioned Dolet's principles in his dedication to the seven books, 1598. The work of a skillful and worthy translator is to observe the sentences, figures, and forms of speech proposed in his author. In the epistle to the reader of his translation of the Iliad, he clarifies his position by saying, 1. Avoid word-for-word rendering. 2. Attempt to reach the spirit of the original. Number 3. Avoid loose translations by basing the translation on a second scholarly investigation of other versions and glosses. Chapman had basically reiterated Dolet's principles by giving importance to the understanding of the text. Thomas Wyatt, 1503 to 1542, and Earl of Surrey, 1517 to 47. Towards the end of the 16th century, Wyatt and Surrey had enriched the status of poetic translation through the translations of Petrarch's sonnet. Sometimes Wyatt and Surrey keep close to the source text in Italian, but quite often they show faithfulness not to the words or sentence, but to a notion of the poem in its relationship to the readers. In other words, the poem is perceived as an artifact of a particular cultural system, and the only faithful translation can be to give it a similar function in the target cultural system. 17th century. During 17th century, we can see birth of influential translators, come theorists like Sir John Denham, Avram Cowley, John Dryden. Undoubtedly, Dryden became the face of the century by his classic triadic division of translation. Dryden divided translation as metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation. Metaphrase, or turning an author word by word and line by line from one language into another. Second is paraphrase, or translation with latitude, the Ciceronian sense-for-sense view of translations. And the next is imitation, where the translator can abandon the text of the original as he sees fit. In Dryden's understanding, metaphrase represented word-for-word translation, paraphrase sense-for-sense translation, and imitation free translation. John Denham, 1615 to 69. John Denham, in his preface to his translation of The Destruction of Troy, 1656, sees translator and original writer as equals but operating in different social and temporal context. The translator's duty to his source language text, according to him, is to exact what he perceives as the essential core of the work and to reproduce or recreate the work in target language. Then Abraham Cowley, 1618 to 67. Abraham Cowley, in his preface to his Pindaric Orders 1656, asserts that his translation aims not so much at letting the reader know precisely what the original author said as what was his way and manner of speaking. Hence, it can be concluded that Cowley believes in free translation. 18th century, Alexander Fraser Tytler, 1747 to 1813, published The Principles of Translation in 1791, a systematic study of the translation process in English, and stated the following principles. Number 1. The translation should give a complete transcript of the idea of the original work. Number 2. The style and manner of writing should be the same character with that of the original. Number 3. The translation should have all the ease of the original composition. The first two principles are basically hinting towards the age-old debate between word-for-word translation and sense-for-sense translation. The first principle indicates the translators to be faithful to the content of the original text, whereas the second one is asking the translators to be free from the source text constraints. Lawrence Venuti argues that in the third principle, Tytler is asking for translators' fluency and ease. Tytler's book can be claimed to be the first detailed discussion of the questions involved. Now let us talk about the 19th century translation theorist. The 19th century was characterized by two conflicting tendencies. One is translator as a creative genius, and the second is translator as a mechanical being. Friedrich Schleiermacher, 1768 to 1834. In 1813, the theologian and translator Friedrich Schleiermacher wrote a highly influential treatise on translation, on the different methods of translating. That treatise is known as. Distinct from the age-old debate over the literal and free translation, Schleiermacher first distinguished two different types of translator working on two different types of text. These are one, who translates commercial text, and the second, who works on scholarly and artistic text, and then he contrasted the translatorial method of alienation and naturalization. Schleiermacher argued that there are only two paths open for the true translator. Either the translator leaves the writer in peace as much as possible and moves the reader toward him, or he leaves the reader in peace as much as possible and moves the writer toward him. The first method, Schleiermacher's preferred one, is called alienation, since it moves the reader towards the writer by means of utilizing an alienating method of translation. Orienting himself or herself by the language and content of the source text, he or she must valorize the foreign and transfer that into the target language. The second one is defined as naturalization. Since here the source text author is moving towards the target text reader as close as possible by means of utilizing an naturalizing method of translation, that the target text reader thinks the translated text as an original text in target language. Lawrence Venuti argues that according to Schleiermacher, these two paths are so very different from one another that one or the other must certainly be followed as strictly as possible. Any attempt to combine them being certain to produce a highly unreliable result and to carry with it the danger that writer and reader might miss each other completely. According to Lefebvre, Schleiermacher advocated word-for-word literalism in elevated language, not colloquial, to produce an effect of foreignness in the translation. The more closely the translation follows the turns taken by the original, the more foreign it will seem to the reader. Now let us conclude the discussion. The theories of translation that has evolved over the ages in the West, from Roman to Victorian period and also in the post-Victorian era, shows that there existed a consciousness among the Western theorists regarding the practice and discussion of different translation approaches which they tried to theorize. This trend was conspicuously absent among the Indian practitioners, and therefore it is very difficult to develop a historiography of translation theory as such in the Indian context. If we follow the trajectory of the thoughts related to translation from the Roman period, we can see how translation theory gradually evolved and how one theorist adds on to the ideas of the pre-existing theorist, thereby enriching translation studies as a discipline. And here we can find difference between the Indian trends and tradition of translation thought and Western trends and tradition of translation thought. Being a multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic country with having different kinds of notions of literature, Indian translation practitioners are failed to propose theories or theorize Indian translation practice with a linear line in the linear line of history. We can evolve, we can write the history of Indian translation theory from ancient to medieval to modern by following the notes of the translators, by seeing the trend of the translation, by following the interviews and the words about translation by the translators or by other creative writers or by the readers who are involved within reading the translated text. We can write the theory of Indian translation, but we cannot find the conscious effort of building Indian translation theory as it happened in West, that there is continuous contribution in the history of thought which is absent in India. We can find that from Roman to Victorian there is huge debate from word to word translation, sense to sense translation, and we can find in 19th century Schleiermacher is contributing about the selfhood of the translator, that translator is a creative genius, artistic person, or translator is a mechanic person. So there is a contribution in the linear history of translation thought which is completely absent in Indian context. We can theorize the Indian practice of translation, but it is very difficult to write or to propose the historiography of translation theory in Indian context, because there was no conscious effort from the part of Indian translation practitioners to contribute in the theoretical development of translation, or there is a absence in contribution of thoughts in translation history of theories in India. So this is how it is very difficult to establish a translation studies discipline focusing on Indian translation practice. When we are practicing translation studies in India, we are mostly practicing the theories which are evolved from Western translation practices, and we are trying to theorize Indian translation practice, but we are still not able to historicize the Indian translation theory. Thank you.